Hello, my loves, and welcome back to Strange Playgrounds. Now, I was going over some of my older work recently, some of the stuff that I had published very early on, um, when I was doing work for Dark Moon Books, as it was back then. It's changed hands since then, and become something a little bit different. But I used to publish articles and short stories in Dark Moon Digest, the periodical, the monthly magazine. And I was looking at the first short stories that I ever submitted, that I ever had the confidence to submit, and that I ever had published. And I really didn't know much back then, other than what I liked, what I enjoyed, and what I wanted to create. And I didn't really have much indication of whether the stories I wrote were publishable or were workable, if they had a market out there. And it's fascinating when you learn that that other people can appreciate the work that you create. It's particularly interesting for writers like me because my work is, I would say, it's impressionistic. I don't plan or plot my work. It's really, I don't, it just, if I do that, it just doesn't work. It does not work. I cannot create mythologies in the way that like Tolkien did, for example, that are really detailed and concrete and explicit and have very particular rules. And it just does not work for me. I don't like that in what I read per se, although I appreciate it. I think it can be. I mean, like, Tolkien's work is the expansiveness of that work is incredible, and the amount of effort and time and energy that the man put into creating every tiny little detail. And the fact that he took it so seriously, that's the most wonderful thing. I mean, he dedicated the latter half of his life to Middle Earth and to its histories and its metaphysics and whatnot. And you can tell by the writing that he takes it deathly seriously. I mean, you read the Silmarillion, and it's like a textbook. It's not like a written book. I think a lot of people, when they come to the Silmarillion on the back of the Lord of the Rings or the Hobbit, they are very surprised, and often not pleasantly so, because the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit are storybooks. They're narrative. They're written as narrative. Where I mean, the Hobbit even more so, I would say, because the Hobbit is very pure in terms of its writing. It is just story. There is hardly anything else to it. It is absolutely pure. It's a rollicking adventure story about dwarves and gold and dragons and giant spiders and adventures with creatures under mountains. It's great. It's great fun. The Silmarillion is not that. It doesn't scan like that. It doesn't work like as an ongoing narrative. It scans more like a historical textbook married to a religious text. At the beginning, it's very like the Bible. Obviously it's based on the Bible because it's Tolkien's Catholicism mingled with other elements of culture that he really enjoys, that he really likes, mythology that he really likes, but which he considers to have been lost. Um, and so it scans it as the Bible scans, or as a religious tract scans, and then it becomes almost historical. So it's not poetic. It's almost bullet point. It's very and then because it's like it's telling you the details of a history, and it's very broad as well. It's very, very broad indeed. It doesn't really give you much detail of what happens. It just tells you that at this time, in this place, this war occurred. It's like the origins of hobbits are a really good example, which the current the Amazon show, The Rings of Power, are kind of exploring. In the Silmarillion, there's nothing there. The Rings of Power, they've chosen in a way, they've chosen a very clever point in the Silmarillion to explore, because they've given themselves license to do what they like, because it's so broad, it's so vague. In the Silmarillion, with regards to the hobbits, it just says at this time in this place a small race of people started to appear, and that is literally it. That is literally it. You get nothing else. The dwarves have a very specific origin, the elves have a very specific origin, men have a very specific origin, but the hobbits do not. The hobbits do not. They just appear at some point, and it's very, very peculiar. But I can't write like that. In the same way that George R. Martin does, when he has very detailed histories and timelines and um, like histories for the families that he creates and whatnot, and I can't do that. It just does not work for me. I much prefer. I'm a pantser, basically. I'm what's referred to as a pantser in the writing community. I usually start with an image or an idea or a concept or even a sentence. Like a sentence will occur to me that I like the sound of, and I extrapolate from that wildly and on the spur of the moment. And it's a very impressionistic and experimental way of writing because sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. Often it doesn't, particularly for longer form work. It's a very unusual way of writing for longer form work because whatever mythology or backstory or history occurs develops naturally and in the moment. And it also means that editing is very important because you have to find the core of the story in the editing process if you write that way, if you don't plan what you're doing, because there's a lot of redundancy. There's always a lot of redundancy. There's always stuff that's spiraled out on a tangent or that has no relevance to the main story arc, which might become the core of a story in and of itself. So you never throw it away. You put it aside. You put it aside and use it as something else. Um, but a lot of my stories occur like that. A lot of the stories that have been published have been pared down massively. Some of the short stories were originally bigger works. They were novellas. They were even going to be novels, but they didn't work in that format. I found that the core of the story, which I would argue is true of most novels, to be honest, the core of the story could be condensed right down to the format of a short story and worked better in that form. And also, even the ones that were written as short stories were originally much bigger, much grander, much longer. But the core of the story was only in that small section. It was in that piece, and it didn't need any wider elaboration. And that only usually only occurs after the fact, after the first draft has gotten down, which is this crazy random the splurging of ideas. It is just the ideas and the images just getting them out there. I think one of the big mistakes a lot of people, like I certainly made when I first started writing seriously, was that you pay too much attention to the quality of your first drafts. If it's not working out how you want it to, then you throw it, you stop, and that's not a good way to do it. To be honest, first drafts are always crap. First drafts are always full of redundancy and nonsense and stuff that doesn't work and stuff that doesn't fit, and you fix that later. That's what I do anyway. You fix it later on. When you go through the editing process, which is the part I dislike the most, I'll be perfectly honest, because it's the most clinical. It has its own appeal. It has its own appeal because it's oddly a contrast and a relief. It's much more technical. It's much more about analysis, critical analysis of the work on a mechanical level, um, rather than that very poetic, very artistic, original splurging of ideas. But it is the part I like the least. I like the first part best. The splurging of ideas and where the concepts and the ideas and the characters are just occurring and occurring and occurring, and you're dredging. I mean, what I tend to do for my work is I'm dredging the subconscious. I'm going to those places where there's deviant and buried and sublimated stuff that I requires expression or requires exploration. That's why I gravitate to horror and to weird forms of fantasy and science fiction because that's what they do best. At their very best, that's what they do. They basically allow culture to dream, to explore elements of itself that it can't in day-to-day discourse or refuses to because they are considered corrosive or taboo or because it just doesn't want to do it. It doesn't want to do it in the same way we generally don't want to do it in our personal lives. That's why the subconscious exists, of course. It's where all that stuff gets dumped. I remember watching an interview with Clive Barker, and he said this about himself that he's not sure he has that barrier. He thinks there's some sort of missing piece in between his conscious and his subconscious, or the barrier is it's very worn. There are holes and rents in it through which the subconscious erupts up. I think that's also true of me. And I think it's true of a lot of writers, to be honest. It's true of a lot of horror writers. I think at our best, we access that stuff. We turn our eyes in to that stuff, the stuff that a lot of people don't want to see, they don't want to talk about, they don't even want to think about. Um, and we use it as the fodder for our work, and it becomes, in that regard, it does become a kind of therapy. And I know a lot of my, well, I mean, all of my work explores certain core themes, as any writers will, because that's where your mind goes, that's where your imagination goes, that's what it will obsess on, whether you want it to or not. The worst thing you can do, I think, I mean, I want to bear in mind, I'm not prescribing anything to anyone. This is all about my stuff. This is how I work, you know. Everybody has their own process, everyone has their own way of working. This is just my way of doing it. I think the worst thing you can do is try and curtail or prescribe the work. If it wants to be a particular way, let it be that particular way. Let it flow. Let it explore what it wants to explore. Let it take the shape that it wants to have. It's a really odd state of mind and a very odd process, to be honest, because you are walking a very fine tightrope all the time. You are, on the one hand, exercising some discipline and control over your own imagination. On the other hand, you are trying to let it flow free. You're trying to let it express itself through you, through your words, through your art, through whatever it is you're doing. And it can neither be too far one way or the other. Because if it is, it fails, it spirals out of control, or it gets crushed into something insincere. And you often, I mean, I think if you read often or you expose yourself to art often, you do gain a nose for these things. Sincerity is, we've talked about this on the channel a lot in loads of the podcasts I've done. Sincerity is a big thing for me. I've got a very good nose for sincerity in writing. And that, what I mean by that is when the writer felt what they were writing passionately, when they felt or thought what they were expressing in a very visceral way, that's always the best writing. That's always the very best writing, because it communicates, it comes off the page, somehow it translates to you. Whereas if something has just been produced as a, you know, because a particular deadline was coming up, or to fulfill a particular requirement, or because just to get something out there, you can tell that too, and it always feels hollow to me. It always feels empty somehow, as though the writer didn't really mean it, as though they didn't really feel what they were writing. And that's part of the trick, of course. It's learning to place yourself in that mindset, in that state of mind, and that takes forever. That's something you've just got to learn, and it does take a lot of failure and a lot of experimenting to find out how you work, to find out how, you know, what is your best routine. It's really, I mean, it's a fascinating discipline. It really is fascinating to exercise. Um, and it's interesting when you find yourself trying to write like other people that you maybe admire. You take their advice and you try to write like they do, and it doesn't work for you. That happened to me a lot, because when you that's what you do, of course. When you first start out, you try to write like the people you admire because you think that's the way it's done, right? And then when it doesn't work, it can be quite debilitating. You can go away feeling as though, oh well, I'm just not very good, or it doesn't work for me because I'm not meant to be doing this. That's another thing a lot of writers feel. There is a sense of like, this is what I'm meant to be doing, and that, you know, that can be quite powerful, and but it also can be quite damaging when it doesn't work out for you. Um, it and then you start to develop, you know, if you, as long as you don't throw out baby with the bathwater and you just jack it in, you start to develop your own habits and your own modes of writing, your own ways of doing things. And that's really interesting, because that's when you're going to start getting your voice. That's when you're going to start writing stuff that is more your own and not like just an emulation of the people you admire. Because when you first start writing, everything you write is an emulation of the people you admire, and you'll always feel those influences. I mean, everybody. I mean, you know, people who read my work, they always compare it to Barker, obviously, because there's a lot of Barker in it. There's always going to be a lot of Barker in it. But I would also hope that they see a little bit of C.S. Lewis, maybe a little bit of Philip Pullman, a little bit of Philip K. Dick, a little bit of Ursula K. Le Guin going on in there, a little bit of Billy Martin, aka Poppy Z. Bright. You know, I would hope so anyway, as well as stuff that none of those writers explore, because it's mine. You know, this stuff is mine. And I think the more you do it, and the more you develop yourself and establish yourself, the more you gain your own status and your own voice, for better or worse, for better or worse, because your particular voice may not appeal to like a wide variety of people. That's just the way it is. My work is very Marmite. My work is very Marmite. I people either love it, and the ones who love it absolutely love it, or it just doesn't sing to people at all, and it's anathema. It's just it doesn't work for them whatsoever, and it's really fascinating. It's really, really interesting. I kind of like being in that place. I really do like being in that place because it means the work has a kind of cult quality, which is a space I like to occupy, if I'm honest. It makes me feel like I'm doing something right, that I'm speaking to the right people, that I'm getting the right people here. And that's really lovely. That's a very lovely thing to have happen, to understand. It gives you a bit of a boost. It makes you feel good. I mean, that's another thing. When other people start to read your work and start to give you feedback, and it's positive and it's good and it's sincere, that's a beautiful thing. That feels really, really good. It does, because again, it gives you, I think, even like some of the most established writers in existence, the icons of certain genres, still feel this. They still feel as though they're almost play acting. There's that imposter syndrome thing where it's not for you, it's not something you should be doing. um or there'll always be someone better than you are, or what. It's really interesting, that because what you produce is yours. It's going to be, no matter what the influences are, it's always going to be idiosyncratic, because it's coming from you. It's coming from a unique set of experiences and state of mind. And that's what you need to lean into. For me, that's what I think writers should lean into. That's what I think artists should lean into. What makes your work yours? What makes it a unique thing, a voice that has never been heard before? That's when it gets interesting. I mean, I'm always ecstatic when I come across work that I never really encountered before. It happens a lot in the independent horror genre, and it just independent genre markets in general. I've found so many voices of late that are writing stuff I've just never come across before. Yeah, I can see the influences in it. I can see the Barker. I can see the Poe. I can see I can see Lovecraft and King and all of the others. But it's become part of something that is wholly their own and wholly unique, and that is wonderful. That is an experience I just would not be without. But coming back to your own writing and realizing like how you wrote, seeing how you wrote it and what it expresses and explores that you maybe weren't consciously aware of at the time, that is brilliant. That is wonderful. Because like the first short stories I had published are the ones that are collated in Strange Playgrounds, my first short story collection. And that those stories were written by a very different person to the one sitting here talking now, just a very different person. A guy who wouldn't have done this for a start, who wouldn't have had the confidence to do this. It was very like a 20-odd-year-old who was very anxious, very socially isolated, very, very depressed, and in a very bad state, in a bad state of mind. But that's what was expressed through the stories. That's what came through. I can't write like that anymore because that person literally doesn't exist anymore. Like, just doesn't. That save as a ghost in my own mind. And funnily enough, that's the kind of thing I like to explore now in my writing. When there are different versions of people that act almost like ghosts, or that are as close to ghosts as they can exist in reality. That's really fascinating to me. When we're haunted by ourselves, our past selves. I love that. I find that really fascinating. Like, I have no problem bringing up that boy, that 20-odd-year-old, in my own mind now, and looking at him as a separate entity in many respects, in a sort of disassociated manner, because I've moved on so much since then. I've changed so much that I can do that now, and that's a good thing. That's a very good thing. If I was sitting here still being that same guy, then we'd have a problem. Then there, bloody hell, at the age of 40, yes, we would have a really big problem at that point. No, I mean, we are different. We are different, and so the things we write change as we age, as we go on. And that's a difficult thing, because audiences generally don't like that. Audiences generally like you to write the same thing over and over and over again. It's just the nature of it. And they can often react very badly when you change milieu, when you change the way you write. But that is just the way it is. That is just the way it is. People change, and so the things they express change, and the things they explore change, their concerns change. Um, I personally love it. I really love to see that transition happening where people are changing as they write. I think that's really, really interesting. Okay, they might change in ways that I dislike or disagree with. A lot of writers have done that. A lot of writers have gone down very dark pathways, especially in the wake of certain cultural events like COVID and whatnot. And in that instance, it's you just have to chalk it up to experience and move on. But no, it's a fascinating thing. The whole process I find to be so interesting, and it's great fun looking back at those concerns and looking at how that person explored and expressed them, because I don't think at the time I would have consciously acknowledged that that's what I was doing. I probably wouldn't. It's just what came out in the stories, because stories are so sincere. Stories, fiction is so sincere in a way that documentary stuff, journalistic stuff often isn't. I've always said that I express myself better through stories and poetry and through in fictional terms than I do through journalistic or documentary material. I enjoy doing that, but I don't think it's as sincere. I think fiction and poetry get at something very fundamental, very human, um, that is far and beyond anything that can be expressed through specific language. Far and beyond in terms of its truthfulness, in terms of its sincerity. And I will always go for the fiction over the documentary material. Always.